So update us. I believe a vote was taken in the Senate yesterday, and unfortunately not enough people joined you and some of your colleagues who did stand against this provision. Update us on the state of the votes being taken place.
You know, I was pleasantly surprised how close we got, actually. Mike Lee and I led the effort to try to remove FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, from the defense bill. There's a Senate rule that says you can't put things into a conference report that wasn't in either the original Senate bill or the House bill. But the bottom line is our arguments were not technical arguments. Our arguments were that FISA collects data on Americans, and they search Americans routinely without a Fourth Amendment warrant. And I think that this is something incredibly important. It's not a rare occurrence. The FBI searched the database for Americans' data, communications, et cetera, over 3 million times in a recent year. So this is not an uncommon abuse of power. And I think it's incredibly important that we say for Americans' communications that you should have to go to a public court, to an Article 3 judge, and obey the Fourth Amendment, that there's probable cause of a crime. Under FISA, they use a lower standard, probable cause of a relationship with a foreign entity, which ultimately really is also really dumbed down or made less stringent to meaning if you've ever talked to a foreigner on the phone. So there's just millions of phone calls, emails, text messages back and forth between foreigners and Americans. And I'm okay with the lower standard if you're going to be searching somebody in Libya. But if an American is in the database, you shouldn't be able to search it without going to a real judge in a public court.
So the votes in the House have been described as a Hail Mary. Can you give us a sense of what the landscape is likely to be and what it would take to stop this from being reauthorized?
Well, the rules are very strict on what can be done to a conference report. Now, they have control of the House, so they can either choose to vote on the conference report or they can choose on voting on alternatives that include some reforms. But a few days ago, the reforms, they said they were going to vote on two different possible reforms. The establishment bill, which really doesn't, does window dressing and doesn't reform the FISA, and then one by Jim Jordan that actually would have more significant reforms. But then both of those were pulled. So I'm not sure the ultimate outcome. If I had to predict, I think basically they'll end up passing the conference report the same way we did, which punts this debate to the spring. So if I had to guess what's going to happen is there'll be no reform this year, and we'll wait 3 or 4 months and have a possibility of again. But realize this isn't an accident or, oh no, we don't have enough time. This expires every 5 years. And so they've had 5 years to think about it, and we've had several years since the Carter Page abuse of power to the Trump campaign to think about this, and yet at the last minute they seem to have no time. Most of them, this is a planned sort of way of trying to avoid reform. The FBI usually comes forward and says, oh, we'll do better. We promise to do X, Y, and Z, and then they don't do it. For example, a few years ago, Congress told the FBI that every time they searched it, they had to write down a reason. At the very least, write down your reasoning for why you're searching an American. And they searched 3 million Americans and didn't put the reason down, a dozen times. They just don't obey their own rules or any rules. And really what you need is oversight, and it has to be public oversight of Congress.
So many conservative voters are clearly outraged about what they view as abuses of law enforcement, what's described as the weaponization of the federal government. This is one of the top concerns of Republicans who vote in primaries, of Republicans who supported President Trump. Now Republicans hold the House. It seems like it would be so easy and so obvious to get this win for the base. Frankly, what does it say about D.C. that this is? And of course, this is bipartisan. You had very, very liberal, very progressive members of the Senate, Democrats, joining you in this vote because it's really a civil liberties measure, not strictly a partisan measure. And yet, Republicans voters so clearly care about this. Why is it still so hard to get it done in a chamber, not your chamber, but the other chambers controlled by Republicans?
There used to be more right-left continuum on this with progressives coming forward. And, think about back in the 1960s, the left was actually much more condemnatory of the FBI for the illegal wiretaps of Martin Luther King, civil rights protesters, Vietnam War protesters. The left was very good. But when it came about a few years ago that the person that was the victim was Donald Trump, they just seemed to not care so much. The derangement with hatred of Donald Trump made it such that they couldn't remember it's about the principle, not the person. For example, I'll give you, this is a perfect example. Brandenburg versus Ohio is a big famous First Amendment case from back in the 50s. The guy was a despicable person. He was a member of the KKK, and the things he said we won't even repeat on air because they're reprehensible. And yet he was defended by the ACLU, a Jewish attorney, and Eleanor Norton Holmes, an African-American attorney, young attorney, who's now in Congress and has been for a long time as DC's representative. But when she was asked about Trump's comment at the January 6th rally, she basically said, oh no, the First Amendment doesn't apply here. He should be arrested for this. And it's like, my goodness, what happened to not really thinking about the person or what they're saying and thinking about the principle of speech? And I will say one good aspect, though, or one thing that's happened positively is when they voted on Jim Jordan's reform in the judiciary, the vote was 35-2. So really, every Republican and almost every Democrat voted to say that the FBI should have to have a warrant to search the database for an American. And this would be a step forward, but I think the whole database is unconstitutional, frankly. But I would vote for the reform of instituting a warrant requirement because it would at least protect Americans' data to a certain extent.